and gentlemen. It's good to have you all with us this morning. Today we are here to work on rules of origin. And the theme of today's working session is simplifying rules of origin to boost free trade between Cameroon and Nigeria. So why are rules of origin important to begin with? Now, the process by which we trade, the way we market our goods and services, and the way these goods and services are created matter for us, but they also matter for other countries. If you think of your bag or your laptop or a pen, about 3 to 5 countries have contributed to that single product. And so rules of origin allow us to better understand what percentage of a product can be attributed to one country versus the other. I think a practical example we can take is the Milo drink, the beverage drink. It may be produced in Nigeria, but maybe the cocoa could be from Cameroon, some of the plastic could be from the United Kingdom, and so rules of origin allow us to properly tell what percentage of a good or a service comes from a particular country. Now, what are they? Rules of origin are needed to attribute the country of origin to each product, but they're equally the criteria we use to define where a product was made, and it's equally important because they prevent countries from implementing other trade policies like quotas or export embargoes or anti-dumping duties. The reason why we need rules of origin is because if, for example, Cameroon said we import too much cement from Nigeria, maybe we shouldn't have that voted, that would be a horrible idea, because that would mean Cameroon isn't taking note of the jobs and the employment which is created in the factories in Douala, but also in Yaoundé that go into producing that cement. So rules of origin for that product, for example, would allow us to better understand the number of people who are employed in order to produce the product, where the materials are sourced from, and ultimately who benefits from what is produced. So rules of origin are important because they prevent us from having trade wars. They prevent us from unilaterally imposing sanctions or other restrictions simply because we don't understand the compositions of the product. So where are rules of origin used? They're used to implement measures and instruments of commercial policies such as anti-dumping duties and safeguard measures. So in some ways, rules of origin prevent countries from simply going into trade wars or using other unilateral measures in order for them to benefit from trade or shield their industries. They're also used for the purpose of trade statistics, for the application of labeling and marking requirements, and for government procurement. Now, if we look at trade statistics are collected in Africa and in Cameroon, but we always find that there are some gaps. Now, the reason why we can't go online and ask a simple question, the jacket I'm wearing may be from Nigeria, but what component of this jacket was produced in Nigeria, we don't know that. Simply because we've not been applying the rules of origin rigorously, properly recording what materials come into Cameroon or exported to Nigeria, who uses them to produce. All of this is why we need rules of origin, because it equally enables us to collect vital statistics that will enable us to better understand and trade with another country. Rules of origin are equally used for labeling and marking requirements. When you go to a shop or you buy a loaf of bread from the roadside, what you find is that there's always a label. And in that label, you usually see that the product is made in Cameroon, made in Nigeria, or they say that the product was made somewhere else, it was packaged in a particular country. The reason why companies, governments, businesses are able to do that is because of rules of origin. Finally, rules of origin are important for government procurement. We know that the rates and levels of industrialization in Nigeria are slightly much more higher than that of Cameroon. They're an emerging market economy. And although our government is investing in infrastructure, and their government is investing in infrastructure, we're doing that at different levels and to varying extents. So what governments sometimes do is to say, if we are going to build a bridge, there was the recent completion of the bridge linking Cameroon to Nigeria, one of the main transmission mechanisms of trade. Both governments can agree and say that we must make sure that in this project, in building this bridge, we don't import all of the components from China. And so the Cameroonian government would say 40% of this bridge must come from Cameroon. The Nigerian government says 40% of this bridge comes from Nigeria, and jointly together we can use our resources, we can use our capital, we can use our labor, we can use our own materials in order to be able to finalize the execution of the project. So this is why rules of origin are very important for especially government procurement, because our government might be concerned that the steel which is used on the bridge isn't from Nigeria or Cameroon. How can we be sure that the products and the materials we use are from these countries? The only way to do that is by using and applying rules of origin. So, trade in the world is driven first and foremost by the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. But the reason why we are here today to talk about rules of origin is because there are no provisions in the GATT on rules of origin. So global trade did take into account that countries needed to be certain about what products and services are derived from their country, but there isn't any global rule book on how to deal with rules of origin, on how to measure what percentage of a product is derived from one country versus another, or to understand what value countries can attach to a particular good or to a particular service that comes from another country. However, if we look at Article 8 and subparagraph 1, it outlines the need to minimize the incidence and complexity of import and export formalities. Now, we have to be honest that rules of origin is an additional bureaucratic demand from ports, from state officials, but it's necessary. So, although it increases the complexity somewhat, what we've seen with the African Continental Free Trade Area, for example, is that all the documents which businesses, entrepreneurs, and governments can use to denote origin are clearly available. They can be downloaded, they're filled in, there are about 10 pages in total, between 8 to 10 pages in total. And so businesses don't have to grapple too much with them. They're clear and straight to the point. So the information is there. And although it might be considered bureaucratic implementing them, it is what we can describe as necessary bureaucracy. Now, there's a note to Article 8, of course, that the production of certificates of origin should only be required to the extent that it is strictly indispensable. Now, what this means is that we, as a country, Cameroon and Nigeria, can decide when and how to apply rules of origin. We could say, for example, that for bottled water, all we need is that the packaging clearly states that the bottle of water was produced in Cameroon and maybe 60 or 80% of the materials are from Cameroon. That would be a requirement, but that would have to go into the certificate certificate of origin. So, of course, they can be required only if they're strictly necessary, but this also falls within the jurisdiction of individual countries. So why has the relevance of rules of origin grown? Why has the relevance grown over the years? One of the reasons is that there are increased regional economic zones, increased preferential trading arrangements, and all of this means that countries belong to separate zones and therefore they have to figure out how to trade with each other because there are already rules which supersede or which govern their interaction and their trade with one another. Now, one of those rules are of course the common external tariff. But rules of origin are important because a country like Nigeria that belongs to the ECOWAS region and a country like Cameroon who belongs to the CEMAC region can find out ways to work better together without unilaterally imposing sanctions. So the increase in the number of origin disputes from quota arrangements, such as the multi-fiber arrangement and the voluntary steel export restraints remain. Now this is a bit global in nature, but I think we have quite a few lessons to learn from countries who try to apply rules of origin. The voluntary steel export restraint was implemented because countries wanted to increase the domestic content of the goods, but also the services that go into producing those goods. There is an excess steel capacity in the world, and aluminium capacity, notably from China, who is one of our largest trading partners. And so sometimes governments have to take these measures. But with rules of origin, they wouldn't have to take such measures because you'll be able to tell what product originates from what country. Also, there's been an increase in the use of anti-dumping laws. As recently as 2020, the EU imposed anti-dumping measures on China, and then the US imposed anti-dumping measures on the European Union. Now, the reason they can do that is because they can actively see what portion of the goods and the services they produce are used in what percentage of the goods or service they produce is derived from domestic labor or domestic capital or domestic material. So the relevance is growing simply because there's been an increase in the use of unilateral measures such as export restraints, but also other measures which are considered punitive to one country could be export restrictions, as we've seen recently here in Cameroon. So if we look at Article 1 of the Rules of Origin Agreement, it defines rules of origins as those laws, regulations used to determine the country of origin of goods, except those related to the granting of tariff preferences. This is just to ensure that we maintain the consistency with the agreement as we carry on. There are two types of rules of origin: preferential rules of origin, which apply in regional trade agreements or customs union, and also in non-reciprocal trade preferences. So preferences, for example, in favor of developing countries. Cameroon signed the economic partnership agreement with the United Kingdom and European countries recently. These are one of the agreements that they use, and that can be described as having some preferences for Cameroonian businesses. Because in order for Cameroonian agricultural produce to be competitive, they have to stop subsidizing agriculture. And the way they're able to understand the contribution of the agricultural sector, but also what percentage of it derives from the country, is via rules of origin. So preferential rules of origin can apply to regional trade agreements or in customs union agreement. But generally, they must conform with the general disciplines or principles in Agreement 2 of the GATT Agreement on Trade Facilitation Measures. Again, we spoke previously about applying rules of origin only if it's explicitly necessary, and that falling within the jurisdiction of countries. So the preferential rules of origin have to conform with that, in line with Annex 2 of the agreement on rules of origin. The second type of rules of origin is non-preferential rules of origin. These apply in the absence of any trade preferences. If there are no regional, bilateral, or sectoral level agreements, when trade is conducted on the most favored nation basis, when there is a monetary and non-monetary implication, and when trade policy measures such as quotas, anti-dumping, or made-in labels are used, and if there is a direct implication on the volume and domestic industry. Now, this is a long list, but non-preferential rules of origin are used only if you have an important reason to or an important concern about the viability of the domestic industry. A quick example we can take is a company like Citracel that produces home products and cleaning products amongst others. If for some reason Cameroon was interested in supporting that sector of consumer products, they could make it a point that companies such as Citracel thrive, and that the consumer goods sector is protected. In that instance, we're going to have to use non-preferential rules of origin, because if we imported 80% of the materials which are used to make paper towels, then that means that our domestic wood industry won't thrive. And so you can see that there's clearly a monetary and non-monetary implication for that. Now, they also apply in the absence of any trade preferences. So if we didn't have an agreement with Nigeria, and we signed several commercial agreements which cover insurance, financial services, education, just to name a few. If we didn't have such trade preferences, then we would immediately go for non-preferential rules of origin. But because we have an understanding that we both want to trade, we both want our financial sector to operate in each other's country, we both want our education to improve significantly and remain competitive, we obviously don't implement non-preferential rules of origin. Now, if trade is conducted on the most favored nation basis, then you tend to implement or apply the non-preferential rules of origin. Now, the most favored nation tariff schedules are conducive, but they're better than what countries would. They provide better economic gains than what countries would have benefited from if they didn't have the most favored nation basis. That being said, regional agreements and continental-wide agreements are much more effective and yield greater benefits for the populations, but also for industry in general. So now we know there are two types of rules of origin. Preferential and non-preferential rules of origin. But are they really being implemented when you import a container from Nigeria, or you import ore from Egypt, or from any other country? Do we really implement rules of origin? Now, if one looks at paragraph 4.3 of the 2015 ministerial decision on preferential rules of origin, the WTO came up with a formula to calculate and measure rules of origin. But as we'll see in the latter slide, the CEMAC region hasn't gone out of its way to implement rules of origin. Now, we can see that Cameroon grants duty-free entry for products which are produced in the CEMAC region, so to Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Chad, Congo Republic. And the reason why we, yes, Chad and Gabon. Yes. The reason why we do that is because they are in a trading bloc, and so they don't need to implement or apply rules of origin because we believe that reciprocity should generally underpin trade. This is why the general consensus is that free trade can in fact be a win-win, but it's going to take a significant amount of political will to ensure that one can get the outcomes that are beneficial for both countries. And rules of origin only facilitate that. Now, goods that are re-exported to another country do not benefit from this duty-free status. Now, with in the CEMAC region, if you're in Cameroon and you export to Chad, you don't pay any duties. But if one exported this chair to Chad and transformed it into a swivel chair, then of course you would have to pay some duties if you had to re-export that to another country. Finally, such products can be imported from third countries, and they may be taxed at any entry point into the CEMAC and into any other member countries where they are re-exported, which is an illustration, a more succinct illustration of the example I gave. Now, does Cameroon have rules of origin? So, Cameroon does not have rules of origin for non-preferential purposes. And Cameroon does not notify the WTO of any rules of origin, whether preferential or non-preferential. Which means over the years we've just been trading with countries and trading amongst ourselves. And it's been particularly difficult to gauge competitiveness because we simply don't understand what portion of the product is derived from one country versus another. And rules of origin, in terms of rules of origin, it applies mainly to CEMAC and for preferential purposes. But the fact that we have the laws and we have the text doesn't mean that we apply it. And as we saw in the previous slide, in the CEMAC region you can export and import and you don't have to pay any duties, simply because. Now, does Cameroon have rules of origin? So, Cameroon does not have rules of origin for non-preferential purposes. Cameroon does not notify the WTO of any rules of origin, whether preferential or non-preferential. Which means over the years we've just been trading with countries and trading amongst ourselves. And it's been particularly difficult to gauge competitiveness because we simply don't understand what portion of the product is derived from one country versus another. And rules of origin, in terms of rules of origin, it applies mainly to CEMAC and for preferential purposes. But the fact that we have the laws and we have the text doesn't mean that we apply it. And as we saw in the previous slide, in the CEMAC region you can export and import and you don't have to pay any duties, simply because you don't have to pay any duties. However, where the preferential rules of origin come in is where you import a product from Cameroon or you import a product from Chad, and you then use that product in order to create something new and export it to another country. So wherever you have re-export, of course you have to apply the preferential rules of origin, which is what we have in the CEMAC, but it's currently not operational. So community origin status is given to CEMAC member countries, but only for products that are entirely obtained in the CEMAC region. Now, in terms of the local raw materials which are used, we know that Nigeria has a thriving agri-processing industry, and our agri-processing industry is developing at a rather fast pace, but the community origin status will only apply to local raw materials for products that are made in the CEMAC territory. What about rules of origin for manufactured products? So for manufactured products, they must be made from raw material that comprise at the very least 50% of total raw materials. So if you produce a good or a service, 50% of that has to be 50% of the raw material must be derived from the country. And the reason why we have these policies in place is because it's much more important and necessary that whilst we trade, we also take into consideration those who have contributed to the output of a particular good or the output of a particular service. Now, this is for manufactured products. Rules of origin must contain a domestic value added that is at least 40% of the ex-factory price. Now, this is where it's important in trade agreements to be able to understand how rules of origin function, because we need to be sure that the people who supply the raw materials are able to benefit from it. If I produce a laptop which needs lead and 20% of that lead comes from Cameroon and 60% from Nigeria, with separate components, we need to be sure that the producers in these countries benefit. And so this is why this 40% outside of the factory price is important, because we're making sure that 40% of the input, 40% of the price actually goes to those producers or goes to the suppliers of this raw materials. So who determines rules of origin? In Cameroon, it's the Chamber of Commerce, Industry, Mines, and Handicrafts. They are responsible for issuing certificates of origin with regards to exports. But there are exceptions, of course. So this is why it makes it particularly challenging for traders and exporters to go to the institution and then get a certificate of origin issued, because it's quite bureaucratic. For the purposes of applying the CEMAC generalized preference tariff, the origin is attested by the CEMAC movement certificate. So the domestic institutions play a role in facilitating or issuing the certificates of rules of origin. So the rules of origin in the AFCFTA. We know that Cameroon and Nigeria have signed the African Continental as signatories to the African Continental Free Trade Area. But what does that mean for both countries? That means that now we are incentivized, encouraged to begin applying or implementing rules of origin. It's and the African Continental Free Trade Area and the policymakers who came up with this gave some thought to this. And if you look at the technical annexes, all the documents you need in order for you to be able to tell what product comes from one country versus another is actually there. So now Cameroonian manufacturers and Nigerian manufacturers know that in Appendix 1, you can get a certificate of origin, the prescribed text of the origin itself in Appendix 2, the copy of the AFCFTA supplier declaration, and the AFCFTA product specific rule of origin criteria. Now, these are simple documents which would allow us to be able to better understand what part of the good and the service in a particular country is produced, is derived locally versus from another country. Now, the reason we're completing this presentation with the, we're nearing the end with the African Continental Free Trade Area is simply because as signatories to the AFCFTA, and as members of separate regional economic zones, Cameroon and Nigeria are much more likely to trade and but also facilitate trade on the basis of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So in determining rules of origin, there are key steps. First, you identify the product and its classification. Secondly, which market are you exporting to or importing to? Then you also have to determine the product-specific rules of origin, because the rules of origin for a chair and a laptop are different. So you have to determine the product-specific rules of origin. Now, the questions you're asking is the product wholly obtained from one country or not? Does the product contain imported materials from another country? And what about processing not conferring rules of origin? So if you look at the auto industry in Ghana, you would find that they get all of the components from China and then they assemble the car. In Nigeria, however, they produce their cars from scratch. So in terms of processing, what happens if the rubber used in the tires come from Cameroon, or in the steering comes from Cameroon, but it's processed in Nigeria? How do we account for that? Is it, do we attribute 10% of the price, or do we attribute 40%? So these steps allow us to think a bit more critically and logically about how to implement those rules of origin. So there are several methodologies which are being proposed out there. And firstly, some argue that it's important you can take into account the processing resulting in the change in tariff heading. So when one product is transformed into another product, you can look at the change in the variation in the price, if you'd like. And from there you can be able to attribute a specific price to the origin. That's just one way of going about it. You could also go about it by meeting a value or content percentage threshold. So if 30% of my laptop is from Nigeria, then automatically we can say 10% or 20% of the price of the sale has to go to the suppliers or the producers there, and vice versa from Cameroon. Now, you can also understand, you can also use a third methodology, which is simply undertaking specific prescribed processing, which is what countries like Switzerland do for the watches they produce. And in doing this, we have to be certain that a specific process is going to confer a specific amount of increase or a specific outcome to a product or a service. This equally happens with Rolls-Royce cars, where the service and ways of controlling the line is just as important as the materials which are used. So the third method is very useful for Cameroon and Nigeria, because our economies, the service sector is increasingly important. So financial services, transportation, business consultancy, these are very, very important. ICT, machine learning, and software development. So we need to be able to attribute some value to our workforce and our labor force if need be, and the third methodology is particularly helpful. So what has been achieved so far when rules of origin are concerned? In July 2020, about 86% of the AFCFTA rules of origin provisions were agreed. Now, there are scattered issues about how countries are going to implement rules of origin, about how they can implement rules of origin and also protect the domestic industries without unilaterally using other measures. And 14% of negotiations are still incomplete. Now, with those scattered issues, they can be broken down further into textiles and automotive, where up to 10.5% hasn't been agreed. Because if you buy a material from one country and dye it in another, how much value do we confer to the country where it's dyed? And finally, in July 2021, 28 tariff offers were officially certified, which means that if they wanted to implement rules of origin, they could begin using the tariff method which we saw in the previous slide. Now, in terms of excluded products, tobacco, we know that the rules exclude HS2402 cigars, and we know that blends are permitted, and the wholly obtained rule should include a percentage of tolerance, which means that if a cigarette was produced in Cameroon, you could say maybe rules of origin don't apply for up to 10% of that. Rules of origin for vehicles, there are notable differences that already exist between manufacturing and assembly. The threshold for non-originating materials can be used, and a compromise of 60% tolerance will transition to 50% in 5 years. So for now, if 60% of a product is imported, we can implement rules of origin in a manner which favors the importing country. For AFCFTA rules of origin for textile clothing and household textiles, distinct stages of local transformation, just as we've seen in manufacturing, double transformation criterion for fabric to ensure that companies and businesses are properly rewarded for the work and the efforts that goes into producing a particular good or service. And finally, the value of non-originating material should not exceed 60% of the factory's selling price. So the materials that you get shouldn't be much more expensive than the selling price of the product. So this, we've come to the end of the presentation. These exceptions are exactly why we're here today. We're here to discuss and better understand how we can facilitate the implementation of this, what we can call problem areas, into the final AFCFTA and support the country level implementation. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to talking with you.